The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Soft sunlight fell through tall windows, making the dust particles glow like tiny golden stars. In the corner, the piano sat quietly, its black and white keys waiting for someone to breathe life into them. People were already gathered, whispering softly among themselves, and their eyes occasionally flicked toward the young woman standing a few feet away from the instrument. She looked ordinary at first glance, dressed simply, with her hair loosely tied back. There was nothing about her that would make anyone expect the extraordinary. The young woman took a deep breath. She could feel the soft gaze of dozens of people upon her. Their expectations were clear. They wanted her to play quietly, gently, the kind of music that could fade into the background like a calm breeze. It was a polite room, a polite audience, and they wanted politeness in return. But as she adjusted her fingers on the keys, she felt a strange tension rise inside her. The piano did not feel like a prop. It felt alive, waiting for her to make a choice, to tell a story. She looked at the first notes in her mind, thinking about how carefully she should start. Her heart was beating steadily, not with fear, but with anticipation. Music had always been her refuge, the one place where she could be herself without judgment. Yet today felt different. Today, she was not just playing for herself. She was playing for people who expected something safe and comfortable. That expectation pressed down on her shoulders like a weight. The first sound came quietly, as expected. The soft, deliberate notes moved through the room, brushing against ears like gentle wind. Some people nodded, satisfied. A few whispered to one another, commenting on how delicate her playing was. She smiled faintly, but did not let herself relax. There was a small spark in her that wanted more, that wanted to surprise them, to take the gentle expectation and turn it upside down. But she kept going, letting the music flow carefully, testing the waters. As she played, she remembered afternoons spent at home, practicing alone, when the world outside did not exist. She remembered the feeling of freedom when her fingers danced over the keys, when her emotions could spill out in sound without fear of judgment. She thought about the times she had hidden her talent, pretending to play softly because others had told her that loud or bold music was inappropriate or selfish. She remembered the ache in her chest from never being allowed to fully express herself. Today, she promised herself things would be different. Her eyes scanned the room again. The audience was polite, almost too polite. Some faces were curious, some skeptical, but all of them had one thought: play softly, do not disturb the calm. They did not know that the soft beginning was just a prelude, that what would come next would challenge everything they assumed about her. She allowed herself a small smile and let the notes rise slightly, just enough to hint at what was underneath. Her fingers moved with precision, yet there was an undercurrent of emotion, a thread of something deeper. The music shifted subtly, drawing in the listeners. They did not yet notice it consciously, but their ears were catching the change. It was the difference between polite noise and true expression. The young woman felt a thrill, quiet rebellion in the way the piano began to sing under her touch. Memories flooded her mind as she continued. She remembered the evenings when her family had gathered around the piano at home. It had been a different piano, older and slightly out of tune. But it had been hers in the way that matters most: her companion, her teacher, her confidant. She remembered the encouragement she had received in small doses. A smile here, a nod there, a whisper of beautiful when she least expected it. Those moments had shaped her, had made her understand that music could speak louder than words, that it could reveal truth where nothing else could. Her fingers lingered on certain keys, pressing them just a fraction longer, letting the sound resonate and fill the corners of the room. Some of the audience shifted slightly in their seats, sensing the subtle change, though they could not yet articulate why. The young woman's eyes flicked to the people around her. They were trying to categorize her, to fit her into a box of expectations. She allowed them to do so for a moment. Letting the tension rise like the calm before a storm, she thought about the first time she had performed in front of strangers. Years ago, the anxiety had been crushing, and she had played exactly what was expected: perfectly polite, perfectly safe. The applause had felt hollow because it was based on compliance, not on truth. That lesson had stayed with her. It had taught her that people often value comfort over honesty, predictability over courage. But it had also taught her that when she finally dared to play her own music, the impact could be undeniable. Slowly, she began to introduce small variations, subtle shifts in rhythm and tone that hinted at something more. The audience noticed a slight tension in the melody, a hint of personality breaking through. Some looked at each other, curious. Some frowned slightly, unsettled by the tiny breach in the rules of expectation. The young woman felt a small smile tug at her lips. This was at the beginning of revealing herself without warning. The first step in transforming the room from passive listening to active witnessing. Her mind wandered to the idea of expectations themselves. How strange it was that a room full of people could believe they already knew her music. They could see her appearance, her posture, and decide what her playing would sound like. It was almost funny in a quiet, ironic way. She let her fingers hover over a chord, feeling its weight. Then she pressed down firmly, letting it resonate. Letting the vibration move through the floor, through the walls, through every listener's chest without warning. A small gasp came from the audience, not loud but audible. A tiny crack had formed in the wall of their expectation, encouraged. She allowed the music to breathe more freely, yet she maintained a balance. She had learned that control and freedom must coexist. The room was not yet ready for full revelation, but they could sense it approaching. There was a tension in the air, a quiet electricity that made the polished wood of the piano seem almost alive. Her fingers danced lightly, yet with purpose, weaving between soft and firm, between expected and surprising. She thought about her life outside this room, about the moments when she had been underestimated, when her ideas were dismissed, her abilities doubted. Those experiences had built something inside her: patience, observation, and resilience. Each of these qualities now informed the music she played. Every note carried a piece of her journey, though the audience could only feel it in part. Sensing the truth without knowing the story, as the first segment of her performance came to a natural pause, she let her hands rest lightly on the keys. There was a hush in the room. Some people exhaled softly, as if awakening from a quiet dream. Others looked slightly bewildered, unsure how to respond. That was exactly the effect she had hoped for. Polite expectation had been met, but it had also been questioned. The room had shifted imperceptibly, and she could feel it. She felt alive. She opened her eyes fully, scanning the faces once more. There was curiosity now, a hint of anticipation. She could almost see them leaning forward in their minds, waiting for what would come next. And in that moment, she understood something important. Music is not just sound. It is a conversation, an invitation to witness, to feel, to be challenged gently. The first few minutes had set the stage. The next part would demand more courage, from both her and the audience. The young woman adjusted her posture, taking a deep breath. She allowed herself to be present, to let the piano guide her without hesitation. Her fingers rested on the keys, ready for the next phrase. The sunlight shifted slightly, catching the dust in a new angle, making it sparkle like tiny floating stars once again. She smiled inwardly, a quiet, confident smile. She knew the room expected soft, safe music, but she also knew that within her was something stronger, bolder, and more true. She began the next section, slowly at first, letting each note ring clearly and intentionally. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. The music carried her experience, her emotion, her strength. The room felt different, now as predictable, less controlled. And as she continued, she allowed herself a small, private thrill. The performance that had begun under gentle expectation was slowly becoming something extraordinary, and no one in the audience would see it coming until it arrived fully. In this moment, she was not merely playing, she was speaking, revealing, and daring all at once, in the room, unknowingly, was about to witness a truth they had never anticipated. The room remained quiet as the last soft notes from her first section lingered in the air. She felt a gentle hum beneath her fingertips, a kind of echo that seemed to respond to her emotions. The audience had settled into their seats, and though polite, they now looked at her with curiosity instead of expectation. It was a small shift, but she could feel it. The music had opened a door. Now it was time to step further into the space she had created for herself. Her mind wandered to the early mornings when she had practiced alone. The house was always quiet then, the sun barely touching the edges of the windows. And she would sit at an old piano that was scratched and worn from years of use. Her fingers would stretch and reach for notes that felt impossible, and she would press on even when mistakes came. Sometimes she would stop and play softly just to feel the sound linger, to understand the shape of each note. Those quiet sessions had taught her patience, endurance, and the importance of listening not just to the piano, but to herself. Every memory reminded her that music was not just something to perform, but a way to live. Now, sitting at this grand piano in front of strangers, she could feel the weight of her journey pressing gently against her chest. The expectation of a polite performance still lingered, but it no longer frightened her. Instead, it fueled her determination. She thought about the people in her life who had underestimated her. Teachers, neighbors, even family members who had told her to play nicely or don't make it too loud. She had followed those rules for a long time, learning to keep her talent hidden, to shrink herself into a small, acceptable shape. But the time had come to let the full sound emerge. The music was ready, and she would no longer deny herself. Her fingers hovered above the keys, feeling the cool smoothness beneath them. She began slowly, deliberately, letting each note ring with clarity. The melody was soft, but there was a subtle strength beneath it, a pulse that hinted at what was coming. She allowed herself to think about the power of music, how it could tell a story without words, how it could touch a heart even when nothing else could. The audience listened politely at first, but she sensed the shift. Their eyes were beginning to follow her movements more closely. They were curious now, wondering what she might do next. She remembered the small sacrifices she had made for music. Hours spent practicing while friends went outside to play. Nights sitting alone with sheet music scattered across the floor. The times when she had felt invisible, her efforts unnoticed, her talent overlooked. Those memories were not bitter, but instructive. They had built the foundation for who she was today. And as she pressed the keys, she let all of that flow into the music. Each chord carried her past, her struggles, her quiet victories. The audience began to notice the change. There was a subtle complexity in the melody now, a tension that had not been there before. Some people exchanged glances, sensing that the performance was shifting, but they could not yet name what it was. The young woman smiled faintly to herself. She was leading them into a space they had not expected, but she was careful to maintain balance. Music, she had learned, was not just about surprise. It was about guiding the listener, giving them a path to follow, even when it took them somewhere new. She thought about the teachers who had once told her to play softly, to avoid mistakes, to remain in the safe zone. Their words echoed in her mind, but they no longer held power over her. She could honor the lessons they had taught, without letting their fear limit her. She allowed her fingers to move more freely now, adding subtle flourishes and variations that spoke of her personal style. The sound was richer, fuller, alive. The room seemed to respond, each vibration settling into the air and touching the listeners' hearts in ways they could not fully explain. Memories of performances at small local events came to her mind. The applause had been polite, the smiles encouraging, but restrained. She had learned to hide the intensity of her emotions behind careful technique, to play what was expected rather than what was real. But today, there was no need for disguise. Today, she could let the music reflect her true self. She felt a rush of confidence, a quiet joy that came from doing something with honesty and courage as the melody unfolded. She felt a connection to the room, to the people listening. Music was no longer just a personal expression. It was a conversation, a shared experience. Some faces in the audience were moving subtly, leaning forward, catching themselves holding their breath. Others closed their eyes, allowing the sound to wash over them. The young woman felt a gentle thrill at this silent communication. She realized that the expectation of softness had given her a platform, but the real moment was in transcending that expectation, in revealing depth and emotion through each note. She remembered the quiet nights when she had played alone, sometimes crying softly into her hands because the music was the only thing that understood her. Those nights had been formative, teaching her resilience and empathy. She could feel those emotions now woven into the melody, giving it texture and life. The audience may not know the stories behind each note, but they could feel the honesty, the sincerity that came through her touch. That was enough. Her fingers moved faster now, yet with control, guiding the melody with intention. The room was still quiet, but the energy had shifted. There was anticipation, a sense of waiting, of holding on to the edges of what might come next. She thought about the people who had doubted her, who had assumed she would never exceed their limited expectations. They were present in spirit, part of the challenge she was rising to meet. Each note was a quiet triumph, a declaration that she would not be confined to a narrow definition of who she could be. The young woman allowed herself to relax slightly, letting her body respond to the music as naturally as she had during those long, solitary practices. She swayed gently with the rhythm, her expression reflecting the emotions she was channeling. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a partner, a co-creator in the moment. Together, they told a story, one that did not need words to be understood. She introduced small pauses, allowing the notes to resonate fully. Each silence was deliberate, giving space for the audience to breathe, to reflect, to feel. She had learned that silence was as important as sound, that it could heighten the impact of music when used thoughtfully. The room seemed to respond, the air itself holding tension and expectation. She felt alive, fully present in the moment, aware that this was more than a performance. It was a declaration of authenticity. As she moved into the next passage, the melody grew more complex. There were unexpected shifts in tone, gentle dissonances that added depth and color. The audience sensed it, some leaning forward, others closing their eyes, all attuned to the change. She felt a surge of satisfaction. This was the point where polite expectation gave way to engagement, where people stopped listening passively and began to feel actively. She was guiding them, but she was also letting the music flow freely. A delicate balance between control and release. Memories of her early lessons, of teachers who had pushed her to be precise, returned. They had taught her technique, discipline, and patience, all of which were now tools she could use to express herself fully. But she no longer followed their instructions blindly. She followed her own instincts, letting emotion and intuition guide her hands. The result was music that was technically sound but deeply personal. Carrying layers of experience and feeling that could not be faked, the young woman's mind drifted briefly to the concept of courage. It had taken courage to show up, to play in front of strangers, to allow herself to be seen. But true courage, she realized, was in the honesty of expression and allowing vulnerability to exist alongside skill. Each note she played was a small act of bravery, a refusal to conform to a narrow expectation, a statement that her music, like her, could not be contained. The audience was now fully engaged, though still quiet. They could sense the subtle power in the music, the story that was being told without words. Some faces reflected wonder, others concentration, all of them drawn into the narrative she was creating through sound. She felt a sense of connection, quiet joy in the realization that music could bridge the gap between individual experience and collective perception. As the section came to a gentle close, she let her hands rest lightly on the keys. There was a palpable silence, not the polite hush of the beginning, but a shared breath held in anticipation. The audience had been moved, though they could not yet articulate why. She felt the room shift, the energy changing subtly in response to the authenticity she had brought to the music. It was a quiet triumph, one that filled her with both satisfaction and anticipation for what was to come. She looked out at the audience, meeting their eyes briefly. There was curiosity, wonder, and a hint of surprise. They had come expecting softness, but they had received something more: honesty, depth, and emotion. She smiled faintly, knowing that the next phase of the performance would take them even further, that the music was only beginning to reveal its true power. And with that thought, She prepared herself for the next movement, confident, present, and ready to guide the audience through the next chapter of the story. She was telling through her piano. The room had transformed since she began. What had started as polite curiosity had become quiet attention. A tension in the air that seemed to hum in rhythm with her fingers. The young woman felt a surge of energy as she placed her hands back on the keys. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the point where the music could no longer be constrained by expectation. She took a slow, deep breath and let her fingers begin to move with a new freedom. The first notes of this section were stronger, bolder, yet still controlled. The melody rose and fell, intertwining softness and intensity. She allowed herself to feel each note, not as something she had to play, but as something that wanted to emerge from her. The piano was no longer a tool, but an extension of her spirit, a voice that could speak truths her lips never could. The audience felt it too, even if they could not yet articulate what was happening. She remembered the hours she had spent learning to trust her instincts. Each mistake she had made as a child, each time she had faltered during practice, had taught her to listen deeply to herself and to the instrument. The lessons had been quiet, sometimes painful, but invaluable. And now, as her fingers moved over the keys, she realized that all those years had prepared her for this moment. The music was alive, and she was fully present in it. The melody began to swell, growing in intensity. She added variations, small embellishments that brought the music to life in ways the audience had not expected. Some people shifted in their seats, leaning forward, their eyes widening slightly as the sound enveloped them. The music was no longer background. It demanded attention. Each note carried emotion, story that transcended the boundaries of polite expectation. She thought about the countless evenings spent alone. When music had been her only companion, there were times when she had cried softly into the piano, letting the sound carry her sadness away. Other times she had laughed quietly as her fingers danced across the keys, discovering joy in the shapes of sound. All of those experiences flowed through her now, giving depth to the music. The audience might not know her story, but they could feel it, as though the room itself had become a living, breathing presence. As the music continued, she introduced unexpected shifts in rhythm and tone. Soft passages exploded into bold chords, gentle melodies intertwined with sharp, dramatic accents. The audience's polite expectation of a quiet performance was being challenged, piece by piece. She felt a thrill in knowing that they were experiencing something real and unexpected, that her own courage was contagious. The room responded in subtle ways: a held breath, a quick glance, a slight smile of surprise. The energy was electric. She remembered teachers who had always told her to play safely, to avoid mistakes, to stay small. Their words had once felt like chains, but now they seemed distant, irrelevant. She had learned to honor discipline without letting it limit her expression. Technique and emotion worked together, allowing her to convey both mastery and vulnerability. The music was not just notes on a page. It was a reflection of everything she had experienced, everything she had overcome. The melody became more intricate, weaving through the keys with precision and grace. She allowed her emotions to guide her fingers, letting the music rise and fall naturally. There were moments of tension, moments of release, moments that demanded the audience's full attention. Each phrase was deliberate, yet infused with feeling. The room felt charged, alive, as though the music had awakened something within every listener. She thought about the people who had doubted her, who had assumed she would never exceed their expectations. Their doubts were now irrelevant. She was no longer playing for approval or acceptance. She was playing for truth, for the joy of creation, for the thrill of sharing her inner world through sound. And the audience, whether they realized it or not, was experiencing the authenticity of her performance. They were witnessing courage in its purest form. Her fingers moved with increasing speed, yet every note was intentional. The music became a dialogue between restraint and release, quiet reflection and bold declaration. She felt a sense of exhilaration, a joy that came from pushing the boundaries of expectation. The audience responded instinctively. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others sat forward, captivated by the evolving melody. The room had shifted completely from the beginning, from polite curiosity to full engagement. Memories of past performances came to her mind. Moments when she had played for small groups and felt unnoticed. She had learned to play quietly, to blend into the background, to temper her own expression for the comfort of others. But today was different. Today, she was not hiding. She was allowing the music to express the full spectrum of her experience, and the audience was listening with a new openness. The contrast was exhilarating. She introduced subtle dissonances, chords that surprised the ear and added emotional depth. Some audience members frowned slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected sounds, but they were drawn in, unable to look away. The music was no longer just pleasing. It was compelling, a story unfolding in real time. She could feel the room holding its breath, waiting for each note, each phrase, to reveal the next layer of the narrative. The young woman thought about courage again, realizing that it was not just about facing fear, but about being seen honestly. Each note she played was an act of vulnerability, a declaration of self, a refusal to conform to expectation. The piano was her voice, the melody her words, and the audience her witnesses. She felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she was sharing something true, something that could not be replicated or faked. The melody grew richer, fuller, more expressive. She allowed herself to be carried by the music, to let intuition guide her fingers. There was a sense of dialogue between herself and the piano, a partnership that had developed over years of practice and reflection. The audience felt it too, a connection that transcended words. Some were leaning forward, captivated. Others had tears in their eyes, moved by the honesty of the performance. The energy in the room was palpable, shared experience of emotion and beauty. She thought about the nights when she had practiced alone, when music had been her only refuge from doubt and uncertainty. Those nights had shaped her, teaching her resilience, patience, and the importance of listening deeply. Now, that practice was bearing fruit. Each note carried intention, emotion, and history. The audience could sense the authenticity, even if they could not name it. The music spoke for her, and it spoke powerfully. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving with precision and fluidity. The music shifted from soft, delicate passages to bold, dramatic statements. The audience was fully engaged, sensing the narrative unfolding, even if they did not know the story behind it. She felt exhilaration, joy, and a profound sense of purpose. This was why she played, not for approval, not for praise, but for the act of expressing truth through sound. She allowed the music to build to a crescendo, each note carrying weight, emotion, and intensity. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound, as though the walls themselves were participating in the performance. Some audience members gasped softly, others held their breath, all fully present in the moment. The young woman felt a deep connection to everyone in the room, a shared experience of beauty and power. As the crescendo subsided, she allowed a gentle passage to emerge, softening the intensity without losing the emotional depth. The contrast was striking, highlighting the range and complexity of the performance. The audience responded instinctively, leaning into the music, following its ebb and flow. The room was no longer a collection of strangers. It was a shared space of emotion, curiosity, and wonder. She reflected briefly on the journey that had brought her here. From quiet practice in solitude to this moment of shared expression, every experience, every struggle, every moment of doubt had contributed to her ability to play with authenticity and courage. The music was a testament to resilience, to the power of self-belief, and to the importance of embracing one's true voice. The young woman felt a sense of completion. As this section came to a natural pause, she let her hands rest lightly on the keys, allowing the final notes to resonate fully. The room was silent, not from politeness, but from awe. The audience had been transported, challenged, and moved by the music. They had come expecting softness, but they had received honesty, depth, and courage. She smiled inwardly, knowing that the next phase of the performance would take them even further. Revealing the full power of her expression and the truth she carried within her, the young woman felt the shift in the room as she began the next phase of her performance. The energy was palpable, a quiet electricity that seemed to hum in rhythm with her fingers. She had moved beyond expectation now, beyond the polite assumptions that had greeted her when she first sat at the piano. The audience was silent, attentive, leaning forward, and she knew that every note played had the potential to touch them in ways that words could not. She let her hands move freely over the keys. Each chord, deliberate yet infused with emotion. The melody began softly, almost like a whisper, and then gradually rose, flowing into richer harmonies. It was a narrative in sound, a story unfolding without the need for words. She felt herself moving through memories and feelings, allowing them to shape the music. Each note carried fragments of joy, pain, courage, and hope. It was personal yet universal, and she could feel the audience responding. Even if they were silent, her mind drifted briefly to the long hours she had spent practicing alone. When the house was quiet and she could pour herself into the music without interruption, she remembered mistakes that had frustrated her, moments of doubt that had made her wonder if she could ever play with true confidence. But she had persisted. She had learned that every error was a lesson, every misstep an opportunity to grow. And now all of those lessons were woven into the music she played. They gave it depth and authenticity, qualities that could not be replicated or faked. The melody began to swell, gaining complexity and richness. She added subtle variations, unexpected turns that caught the ear and held the listener's attention. Some in the audience shifted slightly, leaning in, sensing the change, though they did not yet fully understand it. Others closed their eyes, allowing the sound to wash over them, feeling its emotional weight without needing to name it. The young woman smiled faintly to herself, knowing that she was guiding them gently, leading them into a space where the music could speak for itself. She thought about the expectations that had been placed upon her, the polite assumption that she would play softly, without daring to push beyond the safe and familiar. It had been a subtle pressure, a weight she had felt in her chest since the moment she entered the room. But now, she was rising above it. She was playing with honesty, courage, and vulnerability. Each note was a small act of defiance, a refusal to conform, a statement that she would no longer be limited by what others expected. The melody shifted, moving from soft, contemplative passages to bolder, more dramatic expressions. She allowed herself to be carried by the music, to let her intuition guide her fingers. There was a natural flow, a dialogue between restraint and release, quiet reflection and bold declaration. The audience felt it instinctively, drawn in by the authenticity and power of her performance. The room seemed alive, every breath held in anticipation, every heartbeat in sync with the rhythm of the piano. Memories of past performances came to her mind. Moments when she had played for small groups and felt unnoticed. She had learned to play quietly, to blend into the background, to temper her own expression for the comfort of others. But today was different. Today she was not hiding. She was allowing the music to express the full spectrum of her experience, and the audience was listening with a new openness. The contrast was exhilarating. She introduced subtle dissonances, chords that surprised the ear and added emotional depth. Some audience members frowned slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected sounds, but they were drawn in, unable to look away. The music was no longer just pleasing. It was compelling, a story unfolding in real time. She could feel the room holding its breath, waiting for each note, each phrase. To reveal the next layer of the narrative, the young woman thought about courage again, realizing that it was not just about facing fear, but about being seen honestly. Each note she played was an act of vulnerability, a declaration of self, a refusal to conform to expectation. The piano was her voice, the melody her words, and the audience her witnesses. She felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that she was sharing something true, something that could not be replicated or faked. The melody grew richer, fuller, more expressive. She allowed herself to be carried by the music, to let intuition guide her fingers. There was a sense of dialogue between herself and the piano, a partnership that had developed over years of practice and reflection. The audience felt it too, a connection that transcended words. Some were leaning forward, captivated. Others had tears in their eyes, moved by the honesty of the performance. The energy in the room was palpable, a shared experience of emotion and beauty. She thought about the nights when she had practiced alone, when music had been her only refuge from doubt and uncertainty. Those nights had shaped her, teaching her resilience, patience, and the importance of listening deeply. Now that practice was bearing fruit. Each note carried intention, emotion, and history. The audience could sense the authenticity even if they could not name it. The music spoke for her, and it spoke powerfully. Her fingers danced across the keys, moving with precision and fluidity. The music shifted from soft, delicate passages to bold, dramatic statements. The audience was fully engaged, sensing the narrative unfolding even if they did not know the story behind it. She felt exhilaration, joy, and a profound sense of purpose. This was why she played, not for approval, not for praise, but for the act of expressing truth through sound. She allowed the music to build to a crescendo, each note carrying weight, emotion, and intensity. The room seemed to vibrate with the sound, as though the walls themselves were participating in the performance. Some audience members gasped softly. Others held their breath, all fully present in the moment. The young woman felt a deep connection to everyone in the room, a shared experience of beauty and power. As the crescendo subsided, she allowed a gentle passage to emerge, softening the intensity without losing the emotional depth. The contrast was striking, highlighting the range and complexity of the performance. The audience responded instinctively, leaning into the music, following its ebb and flow. The room was no longer a collection of strangers. It was a shared space of emotion, curiosity, wonder. She reflected briefly on the journey that had brought her here, from quiet practice and solitude to this moment of shared expression. Every experience, every struggle, every moment of doubt had contributed to her ability to play with authenticity and courage. The music was a testament to resilience, to the power of self-belief, and to the importance of embracing one's true voice. The young woman felt a sense of completion. As this section came to a natural pause, she let her hands rest lightly on the keys, allowing the final notes to resonate fully. The room was silent, not from politeness, but from awe. The audience had been transported, challenged, and moved by the music. They had come expecting softness, but they had received honesty, depth, and courage. She smiled inwardly, knowing that the next phase of the performance would take them even further. Revealing the full power of her expression and the truth she carried within her, the young woman sat quietly for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the piano keys. The room was still, filled with a silence that felt almost tangible, kind of silence that occurs when something extraordinary has happened and everyone senses it but is not yet ready to break it. She could feel the energy of the audience around her, a mixture of awe, surprise, and quiet reflection. The performance had carried them on a journey, one that had begun with soft expectation and had grown into something far deeper. She allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the resonance of the final notes still vibrating in the air. Each chord she had played carried fragments of her life, emotions she had never spoken aloud, moments of struggle and triumph. And now, as she sat with the echo fading, she felt a profound sense of release. She had given the music everything she had, and the room had received it fully. It was a shared moment, fleeting yet powerful, one that could never be replicated exactly again. The audience remained still for a heartbeat longer, as if trying to grasp the significance of what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly the applause began, soft at first, hesitant, and then building in intensity, filling the room with warmth and acknowledgement. It was not just the applause of politeness. It was genuine, heartfelt recognition of the truth and courage she had revealed through her music. Some faces glistened with tears, others beamed with quiet joy. The young woman felt a quiet smile tug at her lips. Knowing that she had connected with each listener in a meaningful way, she remembered the journey that had brought her to this point. The countless hours of practice and solitude, the moments of self-doubt, the times she had been told to play softly, to stay small, to conform. All of it had led to this moment. And she understood now that each challenge had prepared her for the courage it took to play honestly. The music had been her voice when words were not enough, her way of expressing emotions that ran too deep to be spoken. And now the room had heard it, and it had mattered. As she rose from the bench, she felt a quiet strength within her. She had discovered something essential not just in her music, but in herself. That strength was not about being loud or perfect. It was about being true, about trusting her instincts, about allowing vulnerability to coexist with skill. She had allowed herself to be fully present, to express everything she had carried inside, and the audience had responded. That truth, she realized, was the most powerful thing she could offer. People began to approach her after the performance, some with words of admiration, others with quiet smiles of understanding. Each interaction was different, yet all carried a sense of gratitude. She felt seen in a way she had rarely experienced, as though the music had bridged the gap between her inner world and theirs. It was a reminder that art, when expressed with honesty, has the power to connect people in profound and unexpected ways. She thought about the expectations she had faced at the start, the assumption that she would play softly, that her presence would be a gentle background. That expectation had been a challenge, yes, but also an opportunity. It had allowed her to reveal the contrast, to surprise and engage, to show that depth and strength could reside in someone who appeared quiet and unassuming. The lesson was clear. People often underestimate the quiet ones, not realizing the richness of their inner lives. The potential that lies beneath calm surfaces. The young woman reflected on the importance of courage and authenticity. To play honestly required more than skill. It required trust in oneself, in the instrument, and in the audience. She had trusted her instincts, allowed her emotions to guide her, and in doing so, had created a moment that was real and unforgettable. The audience, in turn, had opened themselves to that honesty.